Before 1984 in video games. I am starting with 1984 for my video game series because we are now 40 years from 1984, the year made famous by George Orwell's book, and it was a big year for many things, but not so much in the world of video games. I was playing video games in 1984, probably about when I started. I knew nothing of a video game crash as I was 6 years old and enjoying the Atari 2600, thinking it was the greatest invention ever. I didn't know by then the console had been around longer than I had, nor would I have cared. I do remember games were cheap and plentiful. One of my favorite Atari 2600 games was Midnight Magic, which was released in 1986. So the old Atari was popular in our house for 2 or 3 years at least after the video game crash, and we were still buying new games. Everyone says, oh, the Nintendo was out in 1986, and sure, maybe it was, but in such small numbers, I maintain it wasn't until at least late 1987 and 1988 that NES really took off. I know worldwide the worst year for video games was not 1983, but 1987. 1983 was perhaps the worst year in North America for the North American market, or home market. But things went further downhill after 1983, and globally the video game market was at its worst in 1987. It was in 1988 that the NES really took off and things picked up again, and for me it was 2600 games mostly up until the NES came into the picture for me, I think in 1988, perhaps even 89. In this video, I'm going to look at things before 1984 just to get an idea of where games were at the time. And I am focusing on what I knew and played to a large extent. I was never an arcade person, so I won't be looking at them, and only played a few early PC games in the mid-80s, and won't be focusing on computer games until later. 1983 saw Atari release 30 games on the 2600, including some greats like Miss Pac-Man, Centipede, Jungle Hunt, Dig Dug, Joust, and Mario Brothers, to name some. I think this is the most games Atari had released in 1 year for the system, as things were booming the previous year for them. Atari had expected the 2600 to have a 3-year lifespan. And that was long past. Heck, even Atari was no longer really Atari, as they had been owned by Warner for some time, since '76 before the VCS or 2600 was released. I would say it did have a 3-year lifespan from 1980 to 83, after a slow 3-year introduction, kind of like the NES a little later. Sure, the 2600 was around in 1977 to 79, but people, I think, were skeptical after the burnout on the very basic Pong-type systems that came before, and there were not too many standout titles in the Atari 2600 library. In fact, looking at the library, there was nothing special at all in the first 3 years, right up until the end of 1979 and the release of Superman.
Attention shoppers, the new Atari cartridge game is in.
Excuse me.
Uh-oh, George again.
Ooh, Atari's ASCII battle.
It comes with 27 games, but that's just for starters. You can get 9 cartridges, 187 games.
Blackjack. Oh!
I'd like an Atari.
Sorry, only our demonstrators left.
Mine!
No, George. Mine.
The new video computer system by Atari. More games, more fun.
Hit me, Atari.
Sorry, Miss Channing.
You gonna slam dunk me, Atari?
The Atari video computer system is 20 cartridges with 1,300 game variations you play on your own TV set. Don't watch television tonight. Play it.
I point this out not because Superman is a great game, but it was larger in scope and carried a license of one of comics' legendary heroes. Alone, it would not have saved the system's fate. And the next few months saw no new releases which was normal. But then in March, according to Wikipedia, there were two. Adventure was released, a game which Superman had used a good chunk of its programming from, and it would go on to be a million or so seller. Much better laid out and easier to follow than Superman, this is one of my favorite games ever as it introduced young me to RPGs. Basic as it is, I am putting it in the RPG category. Adventure gave the system something unique, different than a high-score arcade-type game or a simple two-player competitive game. As great as Adventure is in my eyes, the other March release was much more commercial. Yes, the licensed port of Space Invaders. And to many, like myself, this is the version I know and love. But Space Invaders was addicting in the arcade and was also addicting at home, and this boosted the Atari 2600's sales.
Out here we entertain ourselves at home, so we got an Atari video game. There's so many different games to play. We especially like Space Invaders, zapping those little devils from outer space. It's fun, but personally I think the whole idea of creatures from outer space is a little far-fetched.
No other company offers you as many different video game cartridges as Atari.
Atari released other titles in 1980, but no other system sellers, and so, with more systems selling because of Space Invaders, they needed some more cutting-edge games to keep up with this early 80s tech boom. However, someone else had started selling games for the Atari in 1980, and they called themselves Activision. Atari didn't just have to compete with other companies with their systems and games, but now had to compete with some former employees, disgruntled ones at that, who knew the Atari pretty well because they had made like half the games for the 2600 up until that point. In 1981, Atari didn't release a lot of games, only 6 unless you count Sears exclusives, then 9. Nothing great mostly, but luckily there were 2 classics in Missile Command and Asteroids. Activision released 6 games, and there were a couple others listed in 1981 by independent publishers. Still, without the internet, and it being different time, instead of dying off, the top games were doing the job and keeping the aged 2600 alive and growing, even when other better systems were out. However, it was 1982 that the Atari 2600 market was flooded with games. Atari released 16 games for their system, a few pretty good games, but only one that I would call a classic. E.T. However, others would not agree with me. E.T. was overly complicated for people who couldn't read the manual, I guess. I loved it as a kid and still think it's very underappreciated. The problem was Atari paid a lot for the license and made too many copies, and it wasn't what the public wanted. They did the same thing earlier in 1982, releasing the huge arcade hit Pac-Man. They made too many copies and rushed the game, making it far from arcade perfect. Space Invaders wasn't arcade perfect, but some would say it was better. No one said Pac-Man was better. So the only big games Atari had in 1982 were kind of flops.
The Defender sees lots of alien ships. The Defender sees lots of radar blips. Every blip is a ship.
Watch this, I got this guy.
On a body snatching trip. And it's up to Defender to save them. Defender, a great Atari game.
Have you played Defender? It's the newest of the smash hit home video games that just keep coming, only from Atari.
She did better than me. Have you played Atari today?
Activision wasn't the only third party making games for the 2600. There were 111 games beside Atari 16 released in 1982. Atari had only released about 50 games for the system in 5 years, but all of a sudden the buying public is faced with so many options, and who knew back then what was going to be good? Not all of Atari's or even Activision games were great. Yes, to be fair, there were a surprising number of good games, but there was no quality control, and even some adult-themed games made it to the market. So a flooded market, no quality control, and even Atari delivering big-budget flops, all on aging hardware, was never going to lead to a positive outcome. But maybe things will get better in '83. Seeing as the market was flooded with games, what does Atari do? Well, they released 26 games themselves. Nothing amazing, a few decent classics like Jungle Hunt, Joust, a much improved Miss Pac-Man, Dig Dug. Atari was running a big contest with 4 games, the Sword Quest series, and 4 big prizes. It was pretty cool sounding, but this is 1983, so it fizzled out and should be an episode of The Gaming Historian. Maybe it is. I think the most interesting game released by Atari in 1983 is Mario Brothers, which was licensed by Nintendo, of course. We had this game. It was amazing fun, especially in 2 players. It also introduced us to Mario. Well, I guess Donkey Kong did that, but this was the first Mario game. Third parties went nuts and released almost 200 games on the Atari in 1983, most just wanting to jump on the cash cow. Going through the list, a few good ones stand out, but most are unknown, and I'm doubtful there are many hidden gems in there. I think in many cases people should have known by box art and presentation alone that the game would be questionable, but this was a time when box art could be very deceiving. The home console market crashed in 1983, being carried by the 2600. Other newer, more advanced consoles were out, but they were struggling, and they too crumbled in the home video game crash. Many consumers still played video games at home. They still sold, just more cheaply. And some new good games would be released in the next few dark years for the 2600, and probably the other systems too.
You wanna play Berserk?
You're on.
Hey, where you going? The video arcade!
You can't play Berserk at home.
Now you can. Atari!
It's Berserk inside an electric maze where robots shoot with electric rays.
Take that, turkey!
So look out, don't get trapped or you might get zapped. Berserk is here from Atari.
Can you beat that?
And only for systems from Atari.
Have you played Atari today?